Let me start us off with a little bit of a framing of why we're here today. So I sit on the donor side, and so from my perspective, anti-corruption funding is really about sparking collective citizen action and sparking it in an organic but also an integrated way. And so this is part of what we will deal with today. Like, how do we do this? How do we support people on the ground who can make the change? And how do we shift power, especially on the local level, where people are really facing either bad service delivery as the outcome of corruption or have to pay bribes? So how do we localize donor support so that it strengthens citizen space in country? And I have experience as a donor on this from some of the work that we do in Ukraine, where we support NTAC, and we have a representative here who will speak to that a little later. And that brings me to my next point, which is how do we support inclusive anti-corruption work? Where do we see intersectional groups that are working together in solidarity? And we will hear from our speakers a bit on this later on. And then finally, COP27 just finished, and the biodiversity COP is underway. And we know that funding for climate change will increase massively in the next years. And also that a lot of it will flow through mechanisms that are not yet regulated, very gray areas, with a huge risk for corruption. So it's really a ripe situation that we need to get ahead of. We need to make sure that money flows to those that are impacted the most, and that they flow in a way where we can look back in 20 years and say, this actually did well. So I really think that an anti-corruption reset is needed with this in mind. So 3 things for a reset from my perspective: localized, inclusive, and able to tackle climate change. So now I want to hand it over to the panelists to hear from them. What do you think are key components of an anti-corruption reset? And in particular, it would be good to share a story from the ground that embodies this. So we'll start off with Neda, then we'll move to Otte, then Shaska, and then Nikhil. Neda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Sophie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. And special thanks to Shaska for bringing us together for such a timely topic. I'm so glad to be part of a session that is self-reflective in this conference, to really ask ourselves the hard questions of why haven't we had as much impact as we may have hoped for? What is holding us back? And how can we reset as a field? So my contribution here will focus a lot on civil society collaborations, both within and across countries, to be part of this anti-corruption reset, something I feel pretty passionately about. I want to start with a really quick personal story to kind of anchor you in my perspective coming to this work. So 11 years ago, I was just starting my career in this sector and working for an American NGO with partners in the Middle East. I was on my first trip to Egypt, which is the country where my parents come from, and it was November 2011, and we went straight to Tahrir Square because that's where all of our partners were. So we spent a week in the square, and I got tear gassed with my boss and all kinds of interesting things. But I'll never forget this moment where, we were in the square one day, and there was a really old gentleman who was there. He heard that we were a couple, people from this small, scrappy American nonprofit, and he saw that I was wearing a camera, like an SLR professional camera. So he pulled me aside and he said, look, like he was setting up a display basically of all of these tear gas canisters that were made in Pennsylvania here in the United States. And they were all expired. So anyway, so he saw my camera, he heard we were from America, and he was like, take photos, like you need to take this back so that your people know how your taxpayer dollars are affecting us here. And so that really stuck with me from the beginning, especially as a first-generation Egyptian American. I think I've always been attuned to the value of these solidarity networks that we can build across countries, especially because we know that anti-democratic forces collaborate across countries. So why aren't we doing more of the same? So that really stuck with me and has shaped a lot of the work that I've done for the last decade. When we look at the problems, there's so many, but I think there's 3 interrelated problems that I want to focus on. The first, I've already mentioned, of authoritarian solidarity, or solidarity between, anti-democratic and corrupt forces. So how do we respond? The second that we've also discussed as a panel prior to this are the silos, right, that exist even within our side of the camp. You have the human rights folks and the gender and the climate and the anti-corruption specialists. While it's important to specialize, we know that we can also put up artificial barriers that actually inhibit us from working together in better ways. And then third, and most importantly, in my perspective, are the real power imbalances, which exist not just between sectors, like we often talk about, private sector, government, civil society, but specifically the power imbalances within civil society. At every level, within countries, the capital-based NGOs having more power than the regional and rural ones, within regions, different civil society members having more power compared to others, and of course on a global scale, NGOs in the global north compared to the global south. So I'm really glad that we're seeing more conversations around shifting power, but it's clearly still a huge problem. So all of that kind of leads me to a conclusion that we have a real paradox in the anti-corruption field. I would argue that corruption is perhaps the single most universally felt and understood social problem in the world. Like, full stop. It is deeply understood by ordinary people in every corner of the universe, right? It's something that everyone can relate to. And the World Cup is a perfect example of this, right? The things that impact our lives the most, we also know how corruption can taint them. And yet, to kind of participate in this anti-corruption global movement, we often have a really high barrier to entry, despite the fact that this is such a universal experience and problem. So I really want to encourage us to challenge this and think about the value of specialization, but also how do we bring in bigger entry points for engagement, really honoring and uplifting the rich expertise that folks have around the world in this topic. So as part of the solution that I want to propose and then hand it over, is really focusing on these truly inclusive and diverse civil society networks within and across countries. Scaling this effort up to really build peer learning and collaboration, because I really think that's kind of our best hope for the future and moving forward. So just very briefly, some of you may know, but my colleague in the room, Abigail Bellows, and I wrote a paper a few years ago with Carnegie Endowment, which is on the table in the back, that you're welcome to take a look at. But it was building on her great work that first identified this real divide between grassroots and more elite policy organizations in the anti-corruption field. So we really want to, continue to encourage you to think about where you fit in the spectrum and how we can overcome this divide. I'll share some more ideas about that later. But lastly, I just want to end on a very quick example that came out from our research a few years ago, an amazing collaboration and coalition called the Congo is Not for Sale coalition in the DRC. Some of you may know about this. They were in the news recently for some really important work. But in 2020, they built a really successful campaign to change the passport contract in the country. Basically, there was a government contractor, a European business that was hired to produce passports for the DRC. And suddenly, overnight, the cost of getting a passport in the DRC became one of the most expensive in the world, like $300 in one of the poorest countries in the world. So obviously, this presented a big challenge, but the partnership came when policy NGOs did the research to follow the money behind that government contract, and the grassroots organizers brought the public pressure to ultimately cancel that corrupt contract. So I just want to end on that example to help us think again about how are we combining our respective specializations and constituencies to really have transformative change.
Thank you so much, Netta. I really appreciate you honing in on corruption being the single most felt problem across the world. I think most of us here can nod to that. Ode, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out to listen to us. Very impressive and encouraging to be on the panel with amazing persons. But for me, I just want to touch quickly on what this means in terms of supporting civil society networks through international development programs. Firstly, for me, it's around how we want to approach the issue of knowledge building or knowledge community of practice. One key thing we've seen around the space in terms of civil society collaborations, thanks to, permits me to mention the MacArthur Foundation, part of the learning from what we have seen with some of the work we have done with them is also around the sandwich approach, which has given us some insight on how civil society needs to engage and collaborate with each other in terms of developing the impacts they need to work around anti-corruption research programs. So if you look at that in terms of what this means is, in the same space, you have to bring diversity and inclusion into the discussion, meaning you have to think about how do you want to build this collaboration in terms of sectoral approaches, if you're working for instance, say health programs, or in terms of contracting or fiscal transparency, you need to now start looking at civil society in the terms of youth coalitions. How do you want to bring that conversation so no one is left behind? And in terms of persons living with disabilities, coalitions, to bring them into those conversations, to ensure that coalition is also, or that collaboration ensures that everybody's ideas are being captured to deliver what your program design is. Just to look at that in terms of meaningful engagement, for me, I think that is very important to see how we're building that across anti-corruption programs. For me, it looks like what has happened in the Nigerian space, we have a high delegation which is being represented here in different places. The topic talks about breaking down, beyond silos. If you look at the space, one of the key things that has happened is that's competition when it comes to funding. The funding space provides for you to do your job on the field, but nevertheless, this has brought Accountability Lab, like one of the key things for our values is collaboration, which brings us to that space where we begin to build the ecosystem within all these parties to having these conversations in the work we do. Also, I'll jump into what we do as a translocal network for a shared sense of purpose within our members to strengthen long-term common identities, which looks at programs which shares learnings across board in the places we work in. We've seen this with civil society organization and the ecosystem we work with in different spaces, trying to work with unlikely network as well. It's important we begin to think in this approach, otherwise we have a competitive space in civil society where organizations are busy looking out for funding rather than thinking about collaborative approaches that can deliver services and also build trust in the engagement which we have to work around. Another thing I just mentioned, I'd put down here is the joint social value for advocacy campaigns. Talking about communication, one key learning for us as well has been how the approach for anti-corruption program has been and how the communication plan for different organizations has been. We run a project called the Accountability Incubator, and one of the things we do is provide that support for communications to ensure that the young organizations we work in, that approach of how you frame your program, how you frame engagement at the grassroots and your community is well defined, so you are able to pass across some of this thought process. I will jump on to something that's very key to this whole discussion, talking about defending the civic space. While we were having this conversation and planning back at the back end, for me, it's goes about how do we want to begin to support reformers, basically civil society organizations who are driving in that direction in anti-corruption programs. So we support reformers to make sure they have their way in doing the work they do. If you look at the civic space, it has continued to close. The international community, the international community must redouble their efforts in terms of how they provide support to human rights activists and reformers and movements around these places. Just a quick story with the Nigerian community. We had the NSAS back in 2020, and we had a conversation with a couple of people who had come into a space to talk about the intergenerational dialogue between the young people who have come out in the front line to fight the abuse by the police in terms of police brutality. And when we got into that room, for me, it was a conversation that shows how you have to create an understanding or a platform where everybody shares that sense of knowledge and drives to an agenda where we are all achieving the same goal. Otherwise, the experience which... Thank you. I'll come back to that in a bit.
No, please wrap up your point.
Yeah, so it's that space, it's creating that space for knowledge sharing, research, knowledge dissemination with young people, with persons with disability, organizations working on these issues to ensure all of us are on the same page. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ode, and sorry for rudely interrupting you. Shaska, over to you.
Thank you, and please do not hesitate to let the alarm go off for me. So, we've been hearing all these elements that need to go into an anti-corruption reset, and if there's one thing that has struck me from many of the sessions prior to ours during our conference, is that many others have also been talking about the need for what we could call an anti-corruption research, even if it's, for example, tracing money to tackle organized crime and narcos and many different things, which I won't go into because I only have now 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So this is a theme of the conference. Before getting into a couple of points, just to sort of get the discussion going, while we are talking about an anti-corruption reset, let's keep in mind the importance of the other side of it, which is that people, citizens around the world, are mobilizing to address major problems that often involve corruption directly or may involve corruption indirectly. So I would give as an example the Black Lives Matter movement. This is a global movement, and at the heart it's about an abuse of power. It's having an impact, and we could have a whole session on that, perhaps in another conference, but very important. I would give as an example the Me Too movement. We had a session the other day on gender and corruption, and there was a lot of discussion about sextortion. What spurred the Me Too movement? It was about sextortion. We have in the US the March for Our Lives movement for gun violence. There's the global climate movement. So there is a lot happening around the world. So if I could summarize a few points in my remaining 3 minutes, one, I thank my other co-participants here for talking about breaking down silos, because it's absolutely critical. Why do we need to break down silos? Well, some of you, one reason is because we miss what's happening on the front lines where corruption is being tackled. So somebody may be focusing on, quote, peace building and negotiations, but at the same time they're tackling corruption. Somebody else, we also miss the full picture of corruption, on the other hand, if we're just stuck in silos. And I will give you a story for that. So for example, in Madagascar, and some very good research that was done by Ketakandria Rafatoson from TI Madagascar, who, by the way, faced huge harassment before getting here. She has a very good case study about sextortion and gender-based corruption in Madagascar. So if we look at it from a completely siloed perspective, we get something like this. A barometer, an opinion barometer was done in 2000, let me get the data here, 2000, I think it was 2010. And the conclusion was that women, because they have comparatively higher levels of poverty, mean that they are less likely to fall victim to corruption because they lack financial resources to pay cash bribes. Really? Really? Yet, why is it then in Madagascar too, if you look at the medical students who are coming out of the school, out of university in Madagascar, there are so few women that have been going into surgery? Well, once you do a little digging, you see the intersectionality, which I'll define in a second. It's because in that particular part of the medical school at that point in time, there was huge sexual harassment and sextortion of the female students. So they were either leaving medical school or they were going into other parts of medicine to avoid that horrible situation. So if somebody wants to look at these issues and say, oh, well, women don't face corruption, or why is it we need a program to get more women into medical school, unless we understand other parts that we're not just looking at gender or corruption, we are missing the whole story. And then we are missing solutions to address the problem. So I mentioned the term intersectionality. Others have mentioned the term intersectionality. I'm going to give you a definition of it because we hear this term a lot, thankfully. It's now being discussed more and more. But intersectionality was originally coined by a great legal scholar in the US, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And her initial definition you can read up there. I won't read it. But 1 more minute left. That term has also evolved, and it's highly relevant for our field. And if we look at the second definition, then we will see, the first definition is relevant, but the second one is too, the interconnected nature of social categorizations, such as race, class, gender, and, for example, sexual orientation, as they apply to a given individual or group. This can be integrated into our anti-corruption work. It's not just a theory. In the second part of our session, I can give an example of how this can make a difference. And I think I have 30 seconds left, so I think I should end, and I'll get my safety blanket here, which are just like little notes to myself. Civil society collaboration, and then the last thing, which I will mention in the second half, is how do we shift the paradigm of international support for anti-corruption actors and groups in civil society? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaska, and really appreciate you defining intersectionality and how we use it within our agendas. So, Nikhil, over to you.
Thank you so much. Would it be possible to play the slide, which I had given? As it comes on, I'd like to tell you I'm from an organization called the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, which is a peasant and workers organization. What distinguishes it from many other organizations of the kind that we see here from the civil society space is that it's a non-funded people's organization, in the sense it does not take money from either the state or from any foundation. So this hut, which you see here, is, the suggestion was that we speak with stories, and I think corruption is all stories. There is a story behind every act or every system of corruption, and there's a story behind the fighting of corruption. The story of that hut is that this is the headquarters of the organization that I work with. And from this little place and this little hut has emerged India's very, very powerful right to information movement. There isn't the time to talk about it, which ended in national legislation in 2005. Today, there are 6 to 8 million users of the right to information. They put in every year 6 to 8 million right to information applications. And the powerful nature of that can be seen from the fact that over 100 RTI users have been killed since the time that this law came into being, because they are citizens who will not give up. They are citizens who will pursue whatever they are pursuing, no matter how powerful or how big that interest is. And they are citizens who do not care about the term intersectionality, and they do not care either about, because they come to it from their lives, which are intersectional, which are lives that look at whatever it is that is affecting them in a holistic way, and they do not think in silos. And actually, we need to get away from our technical means of looking at corruption to looking at corruption as something that people see as just injustice, as unethical behavior, as something that is not acceptable, and that they will fight it no matter what. And they will fight it with their own means, and they will even craft the instruments that need to be crafted for that. If we can see the next slide. So from this place has emerged a whole range of things. Along with the right to information law, today there are laws for the social audit and public audit, statutory public audits that take place across the country, where you revisit works with people and you ask people themselves whether they got whatever they were supposed to get, and huge amounts of recovery that take place. So what I want to talk about from Sushila's point of view is that when we are looking at a reset of corruption, anti-corruption, it has to be from the point of view of people. Who you see here on the screen, Sushila, is a fourth standard pass person. In 1996, after we had done a 40-day sit-in, day and night, in a town called Byawar, she went to Delhi for a press conference, and where there was the ex-prime minister of the country and several members of parliament. And someone asked her, how much have you studied? And she said, I'm only fourth standard pass. So they said, what do you have to do with right to information? Why have you been at it for 40 days? And there were others like her wearing a particular kind of village-based skirt. And she said, when I, if you can put the next slide, when I send my 10-year-old child to buy supplies from salt and tea leaves and matches from the shop, when he comes back, I ask him for accounts. The government spends millions and billions in my name. Won't I ask them for accounts? It's our money, it's our accounts. So the perspective of people, of Sushila, was simple and straightforward. This is my money in a democracy. It defined democracy, defined democratic accountability. It defined exactly how the relationship of the citizen with the state and with money took place. And it defined the two slogans that defined the right to information movement was Hamara Paisa, Hamara Hisab, our money, our accounts, and the right to know, the right to live. Because for the first time in those mid-90s in India, people started saying it's not an esoteric issue, it's not a journalist issue, it's not an issue of researchers, it's an issue of you and me. If I don't know what's happening in my ration shop, I will not get my rations. If I do not know the medicines in my local public health center, I will not get access to medicines, I will not get access to wages, I will not get access to the right to life. So in the next bit, I just want to end by saying, so it's breaking down silos. Yes, people have broken them down. It's actually a question of dismantling. We happen to be in the room of empires, strangely enough. It's a question of dismantling these empires, these illegitimate centers of power in a democratic framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikhil. I love the slogan. It's our money, it's our accounts. That's fantastic. It really summarizes it.
This if we can bring later. This if we can bring later when I speak next. Thanks.
We will. Thank you. So now I'll open it up to the room. We would like to hear some comments and questions from you in the room that we will bring into the next round to the panelists here. Firstly, I'd like to call on Tatjana. You're sitting up front. If you can give us a perspective, there's a mic down here that should be online. And then if anyone else wants to speak, if you can line up behind the mic, so I'm sure I don't miss anybody, then we'll take a round of questions and integrate them up here. Tatjana, over to you. And please introduce yourself, and if you're affiliated with an organization, a sector, a country, let us know. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Hello, everyone. My name is Tatiana Shevchuk. I'm working for a Ukrainian non-government organization, Anti-Corruption Action Center. We work in sector fighting grand political corruption. Ukraine has quite unique and quite vibrant experience of fighting corruption, especially last 8 years. Because actually 8 years ago we started the revolution against kleptocratic government, and once the kleptocratic government was ousted, there was a window of possibilities to start big anti-corruption work in the country, and it also triggered the influx of donor support who were interested to support anti-corruption efforts in the country. And from that we have like two main lessons. First, a lot of donors come to the ground with their like general ideas what should be anti-corruption, and with like one size fits all. So they think that something that works in other country will work in your country. Of course, we agree that there is like something like universal principles. But each country and each context is different. I will explain with very easy example. In Ukraine, a lot of donors, first what they were suggesting projects on corruption awareness. And you can imagine the country just ousted the corrupt president, and the donors suggested civil society do corruption awareness work. But we have very good experience with working with donors, talking with them, explaining our theory of change, what should be done. And in these 8 years, by listening to the civil society, gathering the civil society, the donors worked out the system how to support the local grown expertise and local grown idea how to change the country, and not bringing something from the outside. And we think it's very important. And the second lesson is the empowerment of anti-corruption work from top to down. Something resonates about the difference about the grassroots and high-level think tanks. We work on the high level, but we were a relatively young organization 8 years ago. But with our work, we managed to gather donor support and the name around the country. And we understand that we cannot, we are not doing this alone. We work in the capital. But mostly very important is also to work with people in the regions, people on the ground. It's important to do the projects with them. Just to, do the project, do some anti-corruption investigations, but the investigations and local lobbying is one thing. It's like project-based, and of course it has some time frames. But this has a very important component that we bring up and strengthen the local activists who probably cannot have enough time or capacities to file the report or know how to go through the audit. We, as a bigger organization, can take money from the donor, do all the filing, and support their local initiatives. That was our experience. And this is very important to have this regional cooperation and grow up their local activists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Really appreciate that perspective. We'll make sure to integrate it in the comments up here. Welcome.
Thank you so much. My name is Maha Tambal. I work for DT Institute, managing Sudan Corruption Program, and I'm from Sudan myself. Thanks for the panelists. I really get hooked to the Watnada and the gentleman. I'm sorry about names, but I mean what you said about how to integrate civil society as a key actor in terms of encouraging mechanisms related to networking, sectorial relationship, advocacy, and so on. And I work for a donor organization, and I have been also previously working for some donor organizations. And my observation is there is a huge corruption in the civil society itself. How can we expecting a civil society to play a key role in combating corruption while the sector itself is extremely corrupted? Sometimes we end up finding that civil society are very clean in terms of documents, are very providing high level of integrity when it comes to documents. When we go to the field, we just see dipping ghost employees and this kind of stuff. And that's really my personal opinion, I see corruption in the civil society is a bilateral relation between the donor and the civil society themselves. Donors, sometimes they don't do their homework, they don't care. They only rely on kind of elite civil society. And I think Shazka and I yesterday, we had a kind of discussion on that. It's just something that really, it's concerning. So my question to the panel, how can we enhance and increase the integrity among the civil society itself? What kind of institutional skills or organizational capacities that really necessary to maintain this level of integrity and to make sure this fund is going really for the nations? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very pertinent. Yes, please.
Hi. Hi, my name is Lawal Bakari. I live in DC here. I run a healthcare consumer experience labs. It's just a design company for healthcare. But I'm here because I also support Budget US, which is one of Nigeria's transparency and accountability initiatives. But they are here in the US now. I'm reflecting on the concept of silos, and it occurred to me that probably we could introduce something into programs that can help us to measure the extent to which they are working in silos or not. So something like a collaborative index that just says, are you working alone? And if you are not working alone, what is the constitution of the initiatives or programs that you're working with? What component of them is government or public sector? What component is core civil society? And probably this could generate like a global picture and immediately realize that one small organization in India is probably supporting maybe 80% of the programs in this region of the world. If that makes sense, I would like to hear your thought about that, and probably it's just an idea that can come into the room. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's take the last question for this round, and then we move on.
I promise to keep it short. I joined this seminar because of the fact that we were going to be talking about breaking down the silos and engaging civil society. And what I'm really trying to push is, let's expand that notion of civil society, and let's talk about the general population, and how do you get them involved? Let's talk about silos. For the past, my name is Jim Valle with the International Economic Justice League, and you have probably seen these hanging around out here. What we do is we engage the general population, but we actually give them rewards, economic and social rewards from day one of joining the organization. We give businesses economic rewards for participating day one, and we give employers the same thing. And we do that after critical mass without asking for one single penny of donation. We're a nonprofit organization. I'm new to this entire segment of the industry in anti-corruption. For the past 3.5 years, I've been talking to different organizations who say, yes, engaging the general population would be wonderful, but it's not what we do, so we can't help you. And anytime we talk to any organization who says, absolutely, engaging the 18 to 30-year-old demographic is perfect, and what you do is amazing, we just can't help you because we're focused on what we do, which is amazing, and I'm not impugning anybody's good work, because yes, there are, I'll call them special interests, whether it is sextortion, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, all of these are very, very valuable movements. But what if we engaged the entire general population, gave them rewards, created this culture of ethical business practices, bring them to awareness, allowed your organizations to be introduced to the general population so you'll get more activists on your, for lack of a better term, special interest, very good special interest. I think if we work on activating general population in an ecosystem that is, yes, it's business-based, and it is for nonprofit, it is a nonprofit, no one's getting rich on it, but it's a sustainable business model. If we can do that, I think everybody in this room and in this entire conference will benefit. I just need to know, how do we break in? How do we break down the silos? How do we cooperate? And I'm looking for any of that help. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very pertinent intervention on how to expand to the general population. So we had 4 questions. We have 4 panelists. Perfect. So I'll give you each a question, both from the room and one from me to reflect on. So Neda, let's start with you. I would both like to have you reflect on Tatjana's comment on donors and one-size-fits-all approaches and how to break that down and how really to localize support. And then it would also be good to hear from you on what are some of the principles for really these types of peer networks, how to make them equitable, how to move just from learning into action, and enable a response to this fundamentally interconnected problem of corruption. Over.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. These are super rich. I want to go deep into all 4 questions, but I'll try to respect the time. So first off, just to clarify as well how this relates to the work that I'm doing and what I've done. So I'm the global network lead at the Obama Foundation. We are not a donor, so you don't have to pretend to be nice to me to see if you can get a grant from us. Just to put that out there, I find that the word foundation can be tricky. But we're a presidential foundation, and we exist to inspire, empower, and connect the next generation of leaders following the legacy of the President and Mrs. Obama. So we run lots of leadership programs and have an incredible global network of mostly younger leaders working in every sector. And my job is to build the first strategy to connect them to work together, including on democracy challenges and climate as well. So just to give that context, I think, again, this topic is so pertinent because I've seen the power of peer networks in the work that I've done at Open GovHub over the years, and I'm bringing that into this new opportunity to formalize a network. But I kind of want to clarify one point that I think relates to a couple of the comments first, which is, again, the nature of these diverse partnerships that we can build as civil society. So again, in the research that Abigail and I did, we advocated for more vertical partnerships between grassroots organizations and the policy specialist professionalized NGOs. Those can be so powerful when we specialize and then build links where we each know our role, right? And we're building complementary assets and strengths to a campaign or to a project. So I do think that specialization is really important, but I also want to note when we take specialization too far and we crowd people out, right? When we close the door for public participation from everyday people, like the examples that Nikhil gave, that's when we take it too far, I think. So again, I just want to name how we can be strategic about building these diverse coalitions in having people at different levels with different roles, but not crowd people out when we do indeed see the opportunity for a broad base of public engagement and support. So I think that's super important. And if it's okay, and Sophie, I'm going to take, actually, I think it was their second comment from our colleague from Sudan. How can civil society have more integrity ourselves? How can we limit our vulnerabilities to corruption? I'm so glad you asked, obviously, because we need to practice what we preach. I'll just mention one example many of you may be familiar with, but the Civil Society Accountability Charter and Accountable Now as a independent, opt-in entity which exists to really try to help especially larger INGOs hold themselves to account in a collaborative, right? So I participated on the review panel for that organization, reading reports, accountability reports, and it's not perfect. I will tell you, I was shocked, honestly. One of my first reviews, I was reviewing World Vision International, which, by the way, I don't know if anyone is here from World Vision, has something like a $4 billion global budget. And I was thinking to myself, why am I one of very few people who is responsible for reading a report that they opt in to produce once every 2 years to add this veneer of account? You know what I'm saying? It felt so minimal compared to the scale of the potential impact, but also the vulnerabilities that come with operating at that size. So again, I think we're moving in the right direction, but we still have a lot more to go. And finally, on the integrity piece, it is universal that we are influenced by money. Our priorities are shaped by money. And so therefore, I'm really glad Nikhil mentioned, for example, how his organization has taken the position not to take grants either from the state or from foundations. Every organization is different and needs to make that assessment for themselves. But I have loved working with a number of our colleagues in Open GovHub's global network to explore business models that can give some independence from donor priorities for NGOs when they identify some kind of paid service that actually is aligned with and is supportive of their mission and gives them some funding stream that they have control over themselves. So just to finish this example, I, as Open GovHub's director previously for many years, my salary was completely paid by my member organizations, and they were my #1 stakeholder. So I was fulfilling my mission if they, to help them work better together and share resources. So I felt such a direct accountability. It was like a direct line. My members are my stakeholders, and they're my customers, compared to the complicated triangles of accountability that we often see in a typical, traditional donor, elite NGO, grassroots NGO. Sometimes there's 10 steps between the source of the money and the source of the impact, right? So these are the types of conversations I want to encourage us to keep having. Oh, can I add with I went off script. Anyway, so So let me ask just very quickly in the room, if we say there's 3 types of civil society groups, there's the professional policy NGOs, right, the researchers and advocates, there's the grassroots folks who really represent constituencies, and then there's hybrid organizations somewhere in between. I would just love to see who in the room identifies as policy specialists, policy professionals, professionalized NGOs, if you want to raise your hands. I think it's just good for us to get a sense in the room. There's no shame, by the way, in any of this. Great. Compared to grassroots organizations, like I feel like Nikhil's description is a great example, grassroots organizations. Okay, and then maybe any hybrid entities that have a bit of both. Yeah, fantastic. Real quick, the Sunrise movement here in the United States, the youth climate movement, I think is a great example, actually, of a really impressive hybrid organization that I've learned a lot from in terms of direct policy and politics engagement and deep local grassroots communities and constituencies having great impact. So anyway, more to say, but thank you for that.
Perfect timing. Thanks, Nada. Really appreciate these points, both sharing some of the resources like Accountable Now. Can definitely endorse that. They are great for the integrity and internal accountability, so it's good to share some of that. So, Ude, I'd like to ask you both to respond to the comment actually on how to ensure the integrity of civil society organizations. I think you have a lot from your organizations to share on that. And maybe also if you can share any reflections on how that looks different in different contexts, if you have anything on that. And then also reflect on how to strengthen these collaborative spaces rather than contributing to competition. And give us some examples of concrete actions to enable both CSOs and movements to form alliances. Over.
Thank you very much. And just to quickly touch on integrity of civil society organizations, thanks, Nada, for that. I think we also have done some work around with Accountable Now, which has also built the lab as well. I'll touch a bit on the work we do at Accountability Lab as a social accountability organization, and as well as touching on dynamic accountability. So if you look at what that means for us is, we owe the responsibility to our communities, the participants, the beneficiaries, which we have worked with over the years. In as much as you want to put all that checks and balances in place, policies and for staff and all that, you also want to understand the role of the beneficiaries in demanding accountability from the organization. We run a project called the Integrity Icon, and one of the meetings we had brought the network of icons to Abuja, and after the meeting, one of the icons asked me personally, how accountable are you to the organization? I was shocked, but which is a very good question, like you've mentioned. And we have to explain all those things at every time, like the checks and balances, the audit process, the board engagements in place, and the Accountable Now engagements, and how we also respond to our beneficiaries at every time they demand accountability, and even down to the staff. If you look closely at what every civil society organization, there's a procurement department, the same way we talk about procurement being the number one most corrupt practice around everywhere. It's still the same thing that happens in not just government, but civil society organizations. So those checks and balances must happen in terms of how you want to put those policies in place, how you want to ensure you have a compliance person, and down to the monitoring and evaluation. One of the things we also do at the lab, beyond just monitoring, evaluation, and learning, we're now beginning to understand the need for accountability from the M&E person. So you can as well look at the books, at the figures, at the attendances for every activity you even conduct down to the grassroots. So we have those things in place. But nevertheless, I think I just want to also touch on collaborations, which we need to make intentional. It takes time from experiences within the Nigerian context. You find out collaborations mostly happen because you have a relationship with colleagues in the space. So it's easy for you to build out around those collaborative spaces and engage in projects which you want to conduct and make those things happen at the community level. But I think it's important I mention that has to be intentional. Secondly, one other learning I also want to touch a bit on is, I mentioned this earlier on what we have done with the MacArthur Foundation. The MacArthur Foundation has put in place for their their grantees a cohort which works around media and journalism, behavioral change, And for sustainability processes, they want to ensure that beyond just grants, civil society organizations are able to work with themselves in collaborative spaces to build that sustainability, to continue engaging in different communities or different spaces in sectoral approaches, be it working around behavioral change, like I mentioned, or media and journalism. So to give you a story about that experience. Once you have an investigative journalist doing work around the space, the media and journalism cohort ensures that once we are releasing that news out to the public, you also want to protect the person who is releasing that. So every other media agency will put that out at almost the same time to ensure the government is not coming for you in terms of trying to clamp you down. But that's for me is very helpful to see how we want to build around that. Thanks to the young man who has also touched on the question, if he permits me to talk about that. That's one of the things I actually put down for response for some of the things I think we should be doing as concrete actions. I think we need to continue having those honest conversations about collaborative spaces. What does it look like in different contexts? How do we begin to build that intentionally, and how has that worked? Trying to touch on that early for me was, what are those learnings? What has worked in terms of organizations working together? I know Budget is working closely with Connected Development on the CETA project, which I think there's been a lot of learnings. Just trying to build on the ecosystem within different spaces will be helpful for us to learn what are those learnings and what is working and what is not working. Possibly a global research about anti-corruption strategies, which we can begin to start thinking about. But lastly, for me, it's more around communication for CSOs and their work collaboratively. If you find out, I think she mentioned as well, there's a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach when you want to think about these things in terms of the sandwich approach. Let me just round off quickly. For we at Accountability Lab, one of the things we strongly believe for the bottom-up approach is with young people, you have to bring out these campaigns or these anti-corruption strategies or programs in ways which they understand. Once you get into the field, you are speaking too much jargons to a young person who doesn't even understand what the word corruption means. But how do you begin to break that down? So for me, communications, we need to start thinking about that collaboratively. I'll end there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ode. Really appreciate it. So Shaska, over to you. I really like the suggestion from the floor around a collaborative index. And I'm wondering if you would provide some reflections on that, basically trying to measure when we work in silos and when we work collaboratively. That could be a great tool. I would love it as a funder. And then I have another question for you, which is, I know that you have a new publication coming out with the U.S. Institute for Peace called Supporting Nonviolent Action and Movements, a Guide for International Actors. So could you also share some of the key takeaways from that, really on how to practice donor support in a good way? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Sophie. So there are actually some very interesting tools that one can actually use and adapt to one's context that can help to look at the development of collaborative activities, networking across different groups and organizations, alliance building, coalition building. And and a lot of them come out of the social movement arena. So for example, there is something called the movement mapping tool that was developed by RISE, which is a movement incubating organization, a hybrid, I would call a hybrid NGO. Then there's something which I think could be very interesting for some of you to look into, which is called social network analysis. That is actually designed to help people understand the development of social networks as a result of their activities. So these are things where one can use them to understand a baseline, to understand maybe down at a certain point in time how things have developed, and then to learn from this along the way. There are other social movement tools. So for example, there's a movement capacity assessment tool that the Global Fund for Women designed. I would just give you another one, the social movement tool that was developed by the American Jewish World Service. So all of these things are available. I'm happy to share info with whoever wants it. They'll also be discussed in my book, which Anne-Sophie mentioned, and there's some flyers. This was based on a multi-year research project that on the one hand had field research that was engaged in 6 different countries around the world to get a sense from those on the ground that are in the anti-corruption, transparency, accountability, governance spheres, the extent of their interactions with external actors such as donors, and then also almost or approximately 85 interviews with donors and other international actors that engage with and support either financially or non-financially those engaged in nonviolent action. So what are some takeaways from the book? It was really hard to find a few pithy takeaways, so I'm going to get my blanket here, my security blanket here, where I have a few so I don't forget them. So one is that international actors need to hold a mirror up to themselves. And again, I use that in a broad way because it isn't just donors. It's not just bilateral donors or foundations. It's also all the different international actors, such as international financial institutions like the World Bank, multi-stakeholder initiatives, research entities. So all of us, we need to hold a mirror up to ourselves. So if we think about accountability, on the one hand, downwards accountability, what about accountability up? Who are the international actors accountable to vis-a-vis those they interact with in countries? And there are ways to think about that. There's not time to go into it, but that is very essential into building into the interactions in an ethical way. Inclusion and diversity at the international level. Are we there yet? No. All one needs to do is go to the who we are pages of a lot of the organizations and see who we are, who's making the decisions, and then come to draw one's own conclusions. Expectations and power. Who defines what should be the agenda, the discourse? Who defines what should be the projects? Who defines what should be the hoped for outcomes? Who defines how to, quote, monitor, evaluate, and learn from? There is a change that's happening, so it's not theoretical, but more and more this is about partnership, or more and more it can be driven by those who are actually the change makers in their countries, on the ground, or at the transnational level. So then what else goes into it? Let me find my page, because I'm going to I'm trying to condense a lot of stuff into 2 minutes that are left. Okay, so shifting paradigms for donor support. Proactive inclusion, intersectionality, two-way accountability, going into integrative practices, so analyzing the interplay across the silos and creating support mechanisms that can reach different groups and people on the ground, regardless of what the focus of the international actor is and regardless of what the focus of those on the ground are. So if there are people focusing on peace building, for example, and they end up tackling corruption, why should they be ignored? Or if there are people focusing on corruption that end up focusing on peace building, why should they be ignored? And I'll give you a really good example from Democratic Republic of Congo. Who has heard about the amazing hybrid organization, social movement called Lucha? Some of you have heard. You can't categorize them because on the ground, it's impossible to categorize. And thankfully, parts of the international community have recognized their great work, and when they are attacked, the parts of the international community have come to their defense, and that made a big difference for them. So finally, I would just add supporting action research. Since I'm affiliated with a university, I can't help but say that. There's ivory tower research, and there's nothing wrong with it. But there's another form of research, which is action research, which is practical. It often is where people on the ground are actually driving the research, designing or co-designing what that research is, what are the questions, how will the research be done, who's going to analyze it, etc. So I'll leave it there, but please, the book is coming out spring, I hope early spring. But I think that there will be a lot of value for different people. And may I add one last thing, Sophie, and then I'll stop?
10 seconds.
Okay, for the last speaker, there's a lot of information out there on how to organize, community organizing and social movements. It's a little different from what you're thinking about, but I think it could help to think a little differently about why and how citizens mobilize, because they are mobilizing everywhere, including in the US around corruption. Thank you.
Thanks, Shaska. Appreciate it. Nikhil, you get to be the last one in this round. So I would really like for you to reflect on that last comment around expanding the notion of working with civil society to the general population. You are the person on this panel who is most solidly grounded in that, so it would be valuable to hear from you. And then I would also like to hear a bit more about the work that you do on the ground. I know that your movement has inspired a lot of people across the world, and so if you can explain a bit more about what you do in practice and how it happens, so we can get some takeaways to go home with. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and Sophie, and thank you to everyone. I think what I'd like to say, firstly, the term civil society itself is problematic because it defines less than it explains. And therefore, it's very difficult. Each one will say, well, I am, and I don't have the time. I would tell you, once I was in a Jeep taking a ride and someone said, what do you do? And I explained, and he said, and he was a tout going to extract money from someone. And he said, oh, I am also civil society. So it can literally be anyone. So the question is, your work should define you. And on issues like corruption, which many people have said, extending it to people are there. They're already doing it. They're mobilizing all over the world. They're doing it without silos. I'll repeat that. We are busy making silos because we are busy saying that's one area that we work in. And that doesn't mean, again, that those areas of work are not important, whether it is gender or whether, and that's why injustice is something that people will fight everywhere. And they will make those connections. So they will fight against gender injustice, or they will fight against race injustice, and they will actually define it in terms of where all injustice means something that they feel is wrong and they should fight. And that's been our experience. I belong to one organization, but that organization is only one part of many others who come together to actually build a movement. And social movements and people's movements have that power. That's what's allowed enormous things to happen that I've had the privilege of being a part of. I'd like to very quickly actually come to, and therefore part of this discussion that I find myself at a loss to, I understand where it comes from, is this whole business of donor-driven, or we get money, therefore we do this. That's a huge problem. That is a problem that you have to recognize as a problem, and it's a problem of a set of people who are not accountable to anyone. If we were in India to have been donor-driven, we would have never achieved what we achieved, because we would have been answering questions to the wrong people. So it's something that we have to recognize that it's a problem vis-a-vis anti-corruption itself. We have to recognize it's a problem vis-a-vis the way the whole system works, and what many people are saying, that there is corruption within civil society. Of course, there's corruption all over. So the accountability has to be to the people themselves. You have to find those mechanisms no matter what you do. But I'll quickly come to another story. So one thing that I want to say, even in this, are we a hybrid organization? Are we a grassroots organization? Are we a policy-making organization? Why should someone else define what we are? We are, when you practice, when you are engaged in practice, you have no choice but to engage with policy. Because policy defines how your practice is going to go, what will happen with those engagements. And one thing that you absolutely keep out of grassroots organizations is theory. People build their theories, but they're the ones who are producing theories. And I would like to tell you, just like Sushila's particular quote, and if we can get that other slide, that last slide, please, back again. Like, her quote was a theory. 4 words define right to information, powerfully. People come and do their PhDs with us, but they produce fat books, but our money, our accounts produces the idea of what right to information means, what it means for people to know and hold accounts and accountability, bring it all together. So people, I'll give you another set of what today we are fighting for. So after the right to information law, which has had a powerful naming and shaming, public hearings, social audits, and I'm not at all laying claim to all of that myself or our organization laying claim to it. We are a part of it. And we are a part of that growing kind of movement that's taken place across the country. In that, you have to move beyond, because the people on the other side are also moving beyond. They are developing thick skins. They used to, by naming and shaming, you would get action taken, because you're not asking for information just for the sake of information. You're asking for information for accountability. You want things to get sorted out. So you started doing public audits. You started doing better systems. As digitized information came, simply open data doesn't mean enough. It has to be information that means something. So if you go on this, I'll just tell you another story. The story, I'm sorry, I'm going to take a minute extra in this, and I'll go very quickly through it. It deserves more time, but I'll go very quickly through it. In one of the places where we were when we were saying what should be the nature of a social accountability law, because we were making a demand for that, and this was 10 years ago, a group of Dalit students who were fighting against Dalit atrocities. So that's like the equivalent of having a Black Lives Matter at a very student level in one area where they were fighting it. We said, what does accountability mean when it's to you? And long story short, first they said, who are we to do it? But they came across, because they had been engaging with this and we had been engaging with them, with what we now call the Bhilwara principles. So they said, number one, firstly, we want jankari. Jankari means not just information, actionable information. We don't want propaganda thrown at us. We don't want information that's meaningless. We want the actionable information that matters. Number two, they said, we don't get a hearing. What do they mean by hearing? On a date that I am saying what I want to say, in the language that I stated. They say we go somewhere, we say what we say, and the response is, oh yes, we've heard you. But no, you haven't heard us. We want it in our language, recorded with a dated receipt. Number three, just give me half a minute, please, to go through this. Number three, they said that even if you give us a hearing, there's no guaranteed action. You may do it in 2 days, 10 days, 1 month, 1 year. So we want within a given time frame a speaking order. If yes, by when? If not, why not? That answer. The fourth is, they said, is that all this is done. I am beaten up, my neighbor has beaten me up, the whole village has watched, none of us are in that process. You sit somewhere and you decide that, oh, there is some validity or not in whatever it is. So we want participation in the entire process of investigation. That's the fourth. The fifth is, they said, in this country, the first people to be attacked are the complainants themselves. So we need protection. So information, hearing, time-bound action, participation, and protection. To that, a sixth which we use, which are village-based public hearings, a people's forum which ensures that everyone, including the administration, is present to take action there and then, that public hearing process. This is theory, it's practice, and it forms the core of our social accountability law, which has come from people. It's not, I'm a lawyer, I've been engaged in many of these drafting exercises, but they've come from the wisdom of people.
Thank you so much, Nikhil. I really appreciate you breaking it into very concrete and actionable steps that others can also use. So we have 10 minutes-ish left. So what we're going to do for the rest of this session is a quick round of comments. If anybody wants to make a last comment, now is the time. You can line up behind the mic, and we'll see if people want to say anything here. Then I'll maybe let the speakers give me one word to put in what you want into an anti-corruption reset, in a word. And we'll try to, and then I'll try to summarize the session, and we will all disperse. So please.
Yes, Joy Aceron from the Philippines, Government Watch. When we talk about power shift and breaking silos in the Philippines, the biggest silos that we were able to break would be between partisan electoral engagement and civil society governance reforms, really the coalitions that you need to be able to build to break, to shift power would involve broad coalitions. And one of my challenges always in engaging the international is really the question of building a countervailing political base that would support reformers on the ground, including politicians. It's very difficult because this is not really the kind of space that would take that up. You don't even, it's non-ideological. That's the biggest challenge of the international space and the anti-corruption discourse. I guess my question is, how do we build that kind of countervailing force and kind of solidarity among the actors that are engaged in this space such that it will truly support the kind of multifaceted action needed on the ground to enable power shifts at different levels? Because if we are just here, even if we say we are breaking the silos and being non-technocratic, the reality is if we don't really create a solidarity and a coalition among all of us with support, it will really not make a difference on the kind of reforms that are being instituted on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure we can fully do your question justice in the last 10 minutes. And if we can't, please, we would love to talk to you afterwards as well. Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joshua Alade from Nigeria. I work with an organization called Nigerian Youth SDGs Network. And what we do is advocating for meaningful youth engagement in policies and programs that would enable young people to be able to lead and thrive. One of the things with respect to shifting power is the fact that you find out that young people are usually kind of left behind, and they are not usually included. Sometimes we kind of see young people as just an afterthought, which is really wrong. And I feel like even for civil society itself, we need to start looking at how can we support young leaders in communities or registered youth movements. It's a project that my organization has been sort of been able to work on because we started off as an unregistered youth group, and before we got like a partner who kind of helped us with our registration process, and right now we are able to assess certain grants. So I feel like we need to open up the conversation itself on how do we meaningfully engage young people, how do we help them to make sure that their voices and their concerns are heard. After now, I'll be part of a panel that will be talking about what we need to do, how we need to do it, and why we need to do it to ensure that the voices of young people are heard. And we all know that the issues of corruption itself, it's something that negatively affects young people. My organization works around entrepreneurship, creating decent work for young Nigerians, and corruption is something that is actually stopping that process. And we need to start creating spaces to support young leaders, especially in rural communities, to be able to have their voice heard in order for us to properly shift power. Thank you.
Really appreciate that intervention. Absolutely, that is very important. So over to the panelists for a one-word intervention of what you think should be in this anti-corruption reset. And if you want to do a 20-second final reflection, you can. So Neda, we'll start with you.
Okay, if I talk faster, it's okay, right? Fantastic. So to Joy's point, which will segue me to my final point, how do we build solidarity to enable power shifts at different levels? I think it's difficult but simple that we start with human stories, right? Including our own. Like, why are we doing the work that we're doing? I gave you a little snippet, earlier for me. Those formative moments that shape us and motivate us give us the moral resources that, frankly, I think are equally, if not more important than the financial resources that we spend so much time talking about. Where is the moral capital that we can cultivate and connect to truly make us resilient, right? I want to just underscore that. that tremendously. And I think that's, again, where cross-country networks need to be part of this reset, right? They give us moral resources, they give us strategy and tactics, and they give us safety and support in moments of crisis. I know some of the Obama leaders came together to protect one of their own who was evacuating Afghanistan a year and a half ago, right? Like, these are the moments where we can step up. But the way that we have to do it is through the relationships. Like, I learned early that you cannot skip relationship building to get to transformative collaboration. It is the essential precondition. So we need to have faith and invest the time and effort to build meaningful relationships that can then be activated for the next window of opportunity.
Thank you. So I'm taking here human relationships.
And
All right.
Stories too.
And
stories lead to relationships, public narrative, Marshall Gans. There's so many brilliant resources out there. I'm happy to chat more. So.
Thank you. Ode, 30 seconds from you and one word that I can add to the summary.
Okay, thank you very much. Once you look at the space, I'm talking about the discussion on anti-corruption reset. It's quite important to understand that civil society that work around this space to build accountability in their communities find this quite challenging because the government is also pushing back on these things. So we find situations where you have authoritarianism, you have the closing civic space or the shrinking civic space as the situation may be. But I think it's high time we begin to work with reformers, work with journalists, work with civil society organizations to build that coalition where we can also anticipate new opportunities or threats, as the case may be, begin to form cross-sectoral collaboration that can support our work. Thank you.
So I'm taking away coalitions. Yeah? If you disagree, let me know. Shaska, over to you.
I'm so glad I came third, because I would have wanted to say what Nada and Ode said. So I'll add to that, and I would say something, and I'm going to give a shout out for Accountability Lab, even though they're not asking me to do this, but balancing the negative of anti-corruption with the positive of what we want. So I learned this from them, and that is positive reinforcement for the kinds of behaviors we want to see that are antithetical to corruption: integrity, duty, responsibility. And one brilliant example is the Integrity Icon grassroots, youth-driven campaigns annually in so many different countries, including very repressive countries that have a lot of violence. So I would just add that to it, and remembering that along with that is thinking about systems, that corruption functions in a system, and we need to think about disrupting the system. And I will give a shout out to a couple of brilliant thinkers in that field, Dr. Diana Chigas, who's in the room, and then her colleague, Shayan Shabatki Church from Tufts University. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaska. So I'm taking here the positive reinforcements. If you disagree, let me know.
I would say that that works with children too, right? Everybody who has children, you need some positive reinforcement.
Thank you.
We have to do it for corruption too. Corruption, but not what we want. That's the opposite of that.
Absolutely. Nikhil?
Thanks. So for my 30 seconds, I would say let the people decide. They actually know best, but in that, empowering people to also understand that when we are saying democracy, that there are many power centers even amongst people. So to have an idea of social democracy or social accountability is to focus on the most marginalized and voice for the most marginalized, because that's when the issues of justice will come forward. That's the second. And the third is to understand that fighting corruption is a struggle. It's not a professional job. It's a struggle. And I'm going to do something a little out of the ordinary. Here, I do it a lot in India, and I have to be true to myself. I'm an activist. So I'm going to ask you all to say this one slogan with me. I know in this whole space there's been no sloganeering. I know if you're fighting corruption, how can you not use slogans? So I'm going to say our money, our accounts. My request will be that you say our accounts, and let's see a little bit. It's a test also for me. So I'll say our money, you say our accounts. Our money.
Our accounts.
Okay, so that's a very middle-class response. That's not a sloganeering response. That's not a people who fight response. People who fight response is put your fist up, say it loudly, feel it. Our money.
Our accounts.
There you go. You feel the difference or not? That's how you have to fight corruption.
Thank you, Nikhil. I really appreciate that. So Netta is over here petitioning me for 10 more seconds.
That was such a good ending. But I just want to give one more call to action because this conference is amazing. There is enormous potential, and yet I think we need to do more action, right? So in the spirit, again, of cross-country networks, like I would just ask each of us before we go home today to identify 5 people in our networks who are not working together, who could benefit from working together. Whether you're in a local level, regional, national, global. Like it literally starts with the connections. And again, I just think sometimes we belittle these efforts when actually the biggest hurdle is just to get started, right? So that's my last word.
Thank you, Netta. All right, I have the joyful task of trying to summarize this. So to be very brief, I think the first one is that life is not in silos, but a lot of our anti-corruption work is. And corruption is really this universal problem. We had the quote, citizens will not give up. And for citizens, this comes from their life. It's not siloed. It's intersectional. And I really love the our money, our account slogan. I think we can go home with that one. But really trying to emphasize that when we are in these silos, we miss what's happening on the front lines. And so we need to have, we can call it an intersectional lens, or we can just call it the lens of what people actually experience on the ground. But we need that to understand the full story and the full solutions. I think there's some really important lessons here for donors, me among them. One is the no one-size-fits-all. And of course, also looking at the power within the funders and who within the funders are represented. Using some of these tools, both for mapping out movements and for mapping out civil society. And then also some of the tools we shared within civil society to ensure that there is integrity. And there were some great examples on, for example, claiming control over the funding through business models. But also having really clear accountability lines and having the guiding question of, are you answering to the right people? And finally, on the point of the collaborative spaces, we had some great examples around coalitions building on the strengths of the different organizations, no matter how we define them and what box we put the organization in. We had the examples of these trans-local networks and trying to build common identity through those. And then some of the last points that we heard from the panel, broad coalitions to shift power, building solidarity through human stories and that you cannot skip the relationships, less jargon, and having actionable information that matters, using positive reinforcement for the behavior we want to see, and then fighting corruption as a struggle. Let the people decide. Thank you. Have a good rest of the conference.
I'd just like to announce I have books, just 2-3 copies of a book that we brought out called The RTI Story, Power to the People. It's for sale because we sell everything. But they're just 2-3 copies. It's $10 for a story written about 4 years ago of the last 20-25 years of the RTI.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everybody.